Hi, good afternoon to everyone. Good morning if you are in the United States, late evening if you are in Asia. It's a great pleasure for me to chair this panel on a most wanted recovery after COVID-19. We have an excellent panel of speakers on this topic. This panel is organized under the auspices of the Italian presidency of the G20 and co-organized by Bruegel, ISPI, and CER, and Elcano. And the speakers, and I will mention them in the order that they will speak for 5-6 minutes each to make it as agile as possible. Franco Bruni, Vice President of ISPI and the lead co-chair of the T20 organized by ISPI and Italy and on the task force on international finance within this framework of the T20. Then next we will have Paul de Grauwe, who is John Paulson Chair in European Political Economy at the European Institute at the London School of Economics. Next we have Maria De Mercis, Deputy Director at Bruegel. Then Elena Flores, Deputy Director General at DG ECFIN at the European Commission. Then Andre Sapir, Senior Fellow at Bruegel. And last but certainly not least, Christian Odendahl, Chief Economist at the Center for European Reform. As said, 5 minutes each. To make it agile, if you want to ask a question, we are using Slido. You can just go to the Slido webpage and the password or code we have for this session, it's recover. I will then pick up the questions and ask them to the panelists in the last third of the hour that we have. But to start this this panel, I give now the floor to Franco Bruni, who is from ISPI and so therefore a co-organizer here of this event. Franco, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, my comments will be on the problem of the debt overhang that will complicate the problem of recovering after the shock of the COVID and after the crisis of the last decade. Well, talking about debt, well, in economics, there are many so-called golden rules. One of them states that it is fine to issue sovereign debt to finance public investment, while current public expenditures should not generate deficits. Many years ago, Mario Monti suggested to enshrine this golden rule in the reform of the European Stability and Growth Pact. Much more recently, when the COVID crisis exploded, another Mario Draghi, recommended on the Financial Times, and I quote, "A significant permanent increase in public debt, also absorbing the loss of income incurred by the private sector and the cancellation of part of private debt." 5 months later, in a widely reported speech, Mario Draghi authored a distinction between good debt and bad debt, still popular in the Italian debate. The debt is good if issued to finance productive expenditures that guarantee its sustainability. Differently from Monti, though, he explicitly admitted that productive expenditures do not coincide with physical investments, as they include, for instance, investment in human capital and research. He is now Prime Minister of Italy, and his government is issuing very abundant flows of public debt for all sorts of subsidies and covering the wounds of firms and households caused by the pandemic. Implicitly and apparently, he is extending further the concept of good debt, much further than Monti's golden rule. The extension, though, is far from being clearly encoded. and reflects political and conceptual complications brought by the COVID shock. 5 months ago, as a co-author of a December 2020 report of the Group of 30, Draghi looked much more Schumpeterian as he recommended, and I quote again, a certain amount of creative destruction as some firms shrink or close and new ones open. Not all struggling firms should receive public support. Resources should not be wasted on companies that are ultimately doomed to failure. Moreover, firms that would otherwise be successful should not receive unjustified windfalls. End of quote. And let me stop here my not only Italian story. I thought it could be a good way to quickly raise the point that to manage the enormous public and private debt overhang accumulated since the great financial crisis and now suddenly increased by the pandemic, we need some sort of golden rule. We really need to have a much clearer idea of what kind of debts, not only how many debts, we can put on the shoulders of future generations. To the extent that the decision is a public policy decision, we cannot leave it to the markets, but from the markets, we might extract some important information for the decision. I only have time for a few words on a desirable golden rule. One, the problem is global, and the general aspects of the rules should be coordinated internationally. The G20 could take care of this in part. Second, an alternative to debt should be always considered redistributive measures via taxes and subsidies. When income and wealth distributions are very unequal, it looks difficult to me to call good a debt that could be substituted by taxes on privileged. And I would also call privileged, for instance, a firm or a household that has been more or less benefiting from the COVID crisis. There are many. And that simply has been much less hurt by the crisis. 3, any strategy to overcome debt overhangs must be associated with smart policies to favor widespread substitution of debt with equity, including deep revisions of the current tax privileges of the former. Recapitalizations in the private sector would also help containing public debts. 4, and final, debt restructurings will be unavoidable in many cases. It doesn't pay to try to hide this fact, as we are doing today, just to avoid, to disturb financial stability. We should gradually and transparently prepare formulas and institutions to perform substantial but orderly structuring of various debts overhang. Well, my list is too short and vague, obviously, and let us work on a better and more complete one. Thanks.
Thank you, Franco. I think this was great, and I think it was important to start with the big topic of debt. And as you, in a few minutes, told us, debt has all sorts of elements, not only macro elements, but as well societal, entrepreneurial, enterprise, kind of elements that touch upon it. So, and good as well that you introduced the elements of redistribution and inequality, because, this panel is about recovery, but as well wants to give ideas on to make this recovery sustainable and as well kind of, more inclusive in a way, avoiding a K-shaped recovery. So thanks for this. And I think, Paul, you will talk about debt too, perhaps from a different angle, but equally important. Paul, the floor is yours. And
okay, thank you.
Are you going to share some slides with us?
Yes, I would like to share.
Wonderful.
Screen. Share. Whoops. Oh. Okay. Here it is. Thank you for having me. So I want to talk about economic recovery and how to exit the crisis. So my starting point is that the economic recovery in the Eurozone is likely to be, to a large extent, automatic. Consumers have dramatically increased their savings during the pandemic, and the Eurostat came out with some numbers recently indicating that the household savings rate jumped from 13% prior to the pandemic to 20%, right? So huge increase, which I think is quite broad-based, right? I mean, many people who kept their jobs have just been forced to increase their savings. And it is therefore quite likely that once the perception is there that the pandemic is over, this will spill over into the economy and lead to a strong boom in consumption. Of course, I know there is great uncertainty about this. There's also uncertainty about the timing, because all this depends on how successful these vaccination programs are. But that's what I expect. And therefore, since there is some uncertainty there, there will probably be need to continue with some fiscal stimulus. The biggest risk that I see is too early an exit, right? So I'm relatively optimistic about the recovery. It will come there, but fiscal authorities in particular, I will focus on fiscal authorities, might be tempted to exit too early. Why? Well, because the surge of the government debt ratios during the pandemic has been quite significant, and already now in some countries calls for discipline, right? Which I think then may also lead us to repeat the mistakes that we made after the sovereign debt crisis. In my view, there is actually no need to impose fiscal discipline because the extra debt that has been issued during the pandemic and actually also prior to the pandemic was issued at historically low interest rates, in many countries 0 or even negative. And as a result, this extra debt will tend to decline as a percent of GDP later on, right? Because we can accept that GDP, once the pandemic is over, will start increasing at nominal rates of at least 2%. I mean, quite a lot of people now are actually afraid that inflation might go to 2 or 3 or 4%, which is good news for the governments, right? That have issued these debts, these government bonds at 0% interest rate. And that 0% interest rate remains there for the maturity of the debt and is in fact not dependent on what the interest rate will do in the future. The future interest rate will not affect that debt that has been created, the old debt. It will only affect the new debt, which in my view, if the recovery is strong enough, will be relatively little because budget deficit automatically will tend to decline. So, but this being said, there is still the issue here that this fiscal discipline may actually be imposed in the sense of restoring fiscal rules because of all kinds of phobias that many people have. And then I will argue that this should be done only if it comes to that, which I hope it doesn't. It should only be done when the Eurozone GDP returns to its pre-pandemic growth path. So here I've done a little exercise of what I mean by that. So I've taken the growth path. I start from 2013, and then I extend the growth that existed pre-pandemic into the future. And that's the red line. The blue line is the actual growth rates of GDP, and the dotted line is the path of GDP that will be followed if the European Commission is right in its forecasts that it came out with in the spring, right? And you can see that under those forecasts, the GDP will hit the pre-pandemic growth path in 2004, right? So that would be the moment when one could conceive of reintroducing fiscal discipline in the form of applying the fiscal rules again, right? So not earlier. Of course, in fact, what I'm doing here is actually estimating the output gap, right? Using a very simple model of the capacity output or potential output, right? So let me contrast this with what the European Commission has come out with in its recent spring forecast. It has a table there with the output gap as the European Commission has been estimating it. And I contrast this with the exercise that I'm doing here. My exercise is the blue bars, and the European Commission is the red one. Is that red? It's orange or something. And you can see the following. And the European Commission output gap estimates, right? Actually, next year, we will have eliminated the output gap, which is quite incredible, right? So the thing will be over next year, right? So we know that these estimates of the European Commission are biased because of procyclicality of the estimation procedure. And this has to do with the fact that the trend line tends to bend. Right? Each time there is a recession, the potential output line, instead of going up, will also go down. And as a result, reducing the output gap. And the hidden agenda behind this technical stuff is this is a program for structural reforms and quick calls for austerity, right? Because in doing so, you can tell everybody austerity is around the corner. And I'm afraid this is the story that will come out here from 2022. We will need discipline again. I'm not asking you to believe my numbers, right? I know it's all very difficult but surely we should keep in mind that the European Commission procedure is biased towards calling austerity too quickly, as it has been doing in the past. So I hope these numbers are not going to be used. The European Commission numbers are not going to be used, while my numbers will be used instead. That's one point I want to make. The next one has to do with flexibility. It's very unlikely that all the countries at the same time hit the pre-pandemic growth path. In other words, that the output gap becomes zero for all these countries at the same moment, the same year. I've done some exercise myself here doing this for a number of Eurozone countries. And what I do find, yes, in the European Commission tells us, with the possible exception of Italy, all these countries are out of the mess next year. And therefore, discipline can be reinstalled. I'm saying, wait a minute. First of all, it's unlikely to be next year. And second, it will be different for different countries, right? Some countries will need more time than others. And therefore, any program of reinstalling fiscal rules will have to take that into account, lest we push some countries into austerity too quickly and leading maybe not to a double dip, but to a triple dip recession, right? Okay, that's it. Here are the years that I think, according to my calculations, is the moment where you can possibly start reintroducing the fiscal rules. Again, this is just an example. I don't want to insist, but the two principles are: don't believe the European Commission that in 2022 it will be all right, and second, have enough flexibility so that when you reinstall or you exit the fiscal policies of stimulus, you don't do it all at the same time. That's it. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks for introducing, the debate on fiscal rules, on the timing of the tightening, and on presenting the case for not tightening too fast and wait, a bit longer. For growth, of course, and paying debt, productivity is key. And I think, Maria, you looked at what has been done to overcome the pandemic, what has been done now to come out of it, and how this affects as well kind of our capacities in terms of productivity and future growth. So, Maria, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Miguel. And also let me take this opportunity to thank the Italian presidency for helping us putting this very interesting panel together on a topic that is undoubtedly in everybody's mind. Even if we cannot talk about a post-pandemic anytime soon, it's important that we start thinking about what happens next, both in terms of removing some of the massive help that was given to countries, as well as what happens in the new normal, what kind of new normal we are going to envisage. And as Miguel said, I mean, productivity is going to be a driving force in a very central point in the way that we can think about the economic recovery, both in the phasing out as well as in the new normal. So I wanted to sort of make 2 points: what happens kind of in the phasing out as we think about phasing out, and also what happens in much more on the steady state when it comes to productivity, but also when it comes to sort of some of the bigger measures, the macro measures that are being discussed. And I'll try and avoid repeating some of the things that both Franco and Paul have said, and make tangential points around these. On the productivity side, the latest estimates we have from Eurostat in terms of the dynamism in the economies on exits and entries, we observe that on average in the EU, the level of new entries coming to the economy has actually returned to pre-pandemic levels. Now, this may not be necessarily a good story. It sounds like a good story. It could very well be that some of these new entries are forced entries, in the sense that people become unemployed and then they take up self-employment. But the fact is that on average in the EU, we are at levels of new entries of firms at pre-pandemic levels. This is not true for exits, but that of course is entirely driven by the fact that we still have moratorium on bankruptcies, and therefore the level of bankruptcies remains artificially very low by comparison to historical levels. So we really need to think about reducing the artificial elements of dynamisms in the markets, but the question is how to do it without necessarily destroying good value and making sure that we allow for those who don't deserve to stay phase out. So the issue of who is productive, who is not productive is crucial here, and it's notoriously difficult to estimate. First evidence on this, and we are working on a project in which we are looking at firm level data on a number of countries. The first thing we observe, it is indeed the least productive firms that have been affected the most by the crisis. So there is an element here that I suppose it is fair to say that the measures that we put in place should be guided by those who were unproductive before the crisis. To the extent that we want to terminate assistance given, it should be those firms that were unproductive before, and therefore, the prices really only just reinforce the levels of productivity. That, of course, is true. However, in the EU, there is an extra element that is important to consider here, and that is that a lot of these firms that are considered unproductive are also very small firms. And in the context of the EU economy, small firms, SMEs, are very big employers. So the level, disproportionately so, I would argue. So the level of employment in their small firms would correlate with actually the fact that may be unproductive. So here there is an element of an extra element that we need to take into consideration. Part of the measures that were given in the EU did not only have the intention of protecting productive capacity, they also really had the intention of protecting employment. And there are important reasons, societal as well as economic reasons, why we want to do that. So to the extent that we are thinking about phasing out help that is given to unproductive firms, these need to at the same time be supported by help given in terms of protecting employment. And therefore, I would be reluctant to remove any help on employment at quite the same speed. So that would be really my first point. Now, in terms of the how to sort of ease out the monetary and fiscal support that was given, I don't want to repeat what Paul said, and he did some of the things that Franco said. I will really side with Paul on this. That to the extent that we remove the massive monetary and fiscal support that was given, it needs to be done at the site of caution, meaning we should go as slow as possible. So, look at the models and what they tell us in terms of when recoveries have coming back, and then overestimate that. I think given the uncertainties of how these things are being modeled, I would be very careful not to believe immediately the speed at which the models are telling us they will be coming back. Huge mean reversion in all the models that all the big institutions introduced, and therefore I will be conservative on that side, go much slower than what the models are telling us, simply because we can't afford to not err in the side of caution. I think that's given also our history with the previous crisis. Now, let me go quickly on the long term, if I may say a few things about what to expect in the new normal. Here again on the productivity, there is a lot of discussion now that you might be following in terms of what will happen to long-term productivity. There seem to be two camps, a very positive camp saying that productivity will increase, it will all come because firms have digitized very fast, they're automized very fast. There was an interesting paper by the ECB, which I would definitely recommend to read, in which they surveyed firms, and they have actually shown that about 75% of firms have really picked up the speed of digitizing and automatizing. So there is efficiency gains as a result of COVID-19, which are perhaps worth noting. There will also be an artificial increase of the level of productivity, given that the least productive firms will necessarily fail. But that's just an artifact, not really an economic reason. And there is also this issue of teleworking, that a lot of people believe that teleworking is actually going to increase productivity rather than decrease it. However, there is also a pessimistic camp on that front, and they're arguing that, first of all, this is very, very uncertain. Andrea, no doubt, will make the point about the global value chains, and to the extent that they may have to reduce in order to be more robust. This will necessarily put a cap on productivity. And then there is the other thing, which I think is also very important for broader terms as well, and that is that we already observe an increase in market concentration, particularly in digital firms. And digital firms are important because they will drive a lot of the recovery, given the relevance in the new productive models. We've seen huge market valuations increases of those firms that are driving the digital part of the economy. So there, I think the jury is still out in terms of what will happen on the productivity. On the macro side, I would just like to make one last point. We are at a unique opportunity where, by chance, we are reviewing both the monetary framework as well as the fiscal framework. This is a coincidence, I think. The monetary framework was delayed by the COVID, by the strategy. The fiscal framework is almost forced into us, where everybody now agrees that returning to the fiscal rules is not a good idea if the rules are in the current form. And here, the point I'd like to make, on the monetary side, I don't want to say anything, but on the fiscal side, we really need to rethink the role of fiscal policy, which is very different now than what it was at the time that the fiscal rules were designed back in the 90s. Back in the 90s, there was no room for fiscal policy other than the automatic stabilizing role. What the last 10 years have shown us is that there is a huge role for fiscal policy now, not only for stimulating growth and sustaining from big shocks, but also in terms of redistribution. So, what we expect fiscal policy to do now is very different to what we thought fiscal policy was going to do back in the 90s. And therefore, to the extent that we need to think about new rules, we need to understand what that new role is. I think that will be important simply because we have no choice. The levels of debt will be big. I mean, Paul said that they will reduce, but I still think they will be at a high level. So we need to learn to live with debt. I think that's a very important point. But we also need to learn to live with the fact that monetary policy will not be able to help as much as it did in the past, simply because it is overextended. So there, I would really like to drive the design of the new fiscal rules, keeping into mind and deciding what we want fiscal policy to do as we move forward. I'll stop here and be happy to contribute in the conversation afterwards.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks. And I was listening to you. I was thinking that perhaps a K-shaped recovery might be unavoidable. The question is, what do you do with the lower part of the cake, right? So how do you deal with that? Talking about as well, of course, the digital impact. I remind our watchers that if you want to ask a question, you have Slido. You go to just Slido, the web page. You put in recover is the code, and you can ask any questions, and I will ask some of these questions to the panelists in due course. Elena, what is the perspective from the European Commission on all of this?
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to this super interesting debate, because I already almost noted the full page of what the Commission should do and what the Commission should not do. So now I will bring that back and have to think about all these recommendations. No, really, it's very, very useful, and there are big questions for which answers are not straightforward. But with let's say the given time, I wanted to just pick up on 3 points. One is a brief comment on the outlook. As Paul said, we just issued the spring forecast and how we read that. And second, some insights on the recovery path for the EU. And third, what are the elements where I see a need for international coordination in that context of the recovery. So the first one, the outlook, as it has been said, what we project now is a bit better than what we had in autumn for both 21 and 22. And basically, this is largely pushed by the stronger than previously expected rebound in the global activity and trade, and partly explained by the US packages. And the second element that we were not taking into account until now, but now we have included in the forecast, is the impact of the recovery and resilience plans that are in the finalization phase by the member states. Indeed, what we also see is that economic policy continues to play a key role, so the supportive policies, as it has been said. And as the recovery takes hold, we see that we need to start thinking about how to shift the policies from, let's say, damage control to ensuring a smooth, sustained and sustainable recovery. And here, as I said, the impact of these recovery plans that we have taken into account in the forecast is not the whole full impact. We have taken a sort of conservative assumption, looking at what is actually known for certain at this point, and basically that means an impact of about 1.2% during the forecast period. Obviously, in order to get that, implementation will be essential. So there one might see an element of maybe uncertainty or to be seen. Our forecast also show that there is an improvement on the employment side, but there I would say labor markets will take time to fully recover. So the potential implications in terms of effects will still be there when we have the real picture about what happened with the companies that are currently, let's say, artificially supported, and how much of these companies will continue to provide employment later. The way we see the risks, it's more balanced than in the previous outlook. And I would just mention a couple of things. I mean, on the one side, on the, let's say, the health-related aspect, which is key, it's really key for the current outlook. We see kind of on the negative, the developments of new variants and some uncertainty about the degree of vaccination or acceptance to go for vaccination in the EU. And on the more positive, we see that the impact of the vaccination on health is more positive than expected, and that will mean that removing restrictions can be quicker. So that's how we see the risks in a way, so more balanced. And then we see on the economic side larger scars than we had in our previous forecast on the negative, and on the positive maybe stronger support for private consumption that we have now in our baseline, let's say. Now, number two, in terms of the policy support, the way we think about that is that clearly what, in a way, at least in the international debate or in the G20 debate, people call like phase one, phase two, phase three of the crisis. In that context, we think that we are still in phase one, and the uncertainty is still very high. And macroeconomic policies should remain supportive, and at the same time, they should remain agile and adjust according to the evolution of the situation. And this is clearly not only the EU view. I think I can see this is a sort of common understanding in the discussion we are having. In other words, what I mean is that monetary policy will continue to be accommodative, or should continue to be accommodative, and the extension of the policy support measures that have been put in place to mitigate the impact of the pandemic still remain necessary, fundamental for the economic outlook in the short run, and that should not be removed. Now, when we come to the famous fiscal rules, I should say that, okay, Paul may think that there is a super hidden agenda. I would not share that view. I mean, we all know the uncertainty around the output gaps. We are doing a lot of thinking about what other indicators one needs to look at. if you look at just the numbers like this, yes, we say that we will be back to pre-crisis levels next year somehow, but that's to be seen. And we also say that the general escape clause, that so the suspension of the fiscal rules should remain active in 22. And we say, and we have said that publicly in a communication in March, that this should be the case at least up to when the level of GDP would reach back the pre-crisis levels. And in that communication, I will not go into the detail. We also explain what are the indicators that one should look at when assessing what is the level of the what is the growth situation and what is the fiscal policy needs. I just wanted to say that we will provide a bit more guidance now when we will present the spring package, which will contain some recommendation in terms of orientation for fiscal policy for each of the member states for next year. So that's not yet out, but there indeed, as Paul said, there will be differentiated approach for across member states for a number of reasons that have already been said. The way we see the phase 2 in this development of the policy, well, we think that fiscal measures will have to gradually move towards more targeted support to the most vulnerable sectors, both in terms of companies, but also in terms of income levels of the population. We think that policy support has to allow the reallocation of resources, maybe not only allow, but support the reallocation of resources in that phase, and shift gradually from worker retention to reallocation, to retraining and reskilling towards supporting the viable firms that can absorb the new labor. And we also think that in that context, it will be at least as important as looking at sort of the fiscal stance to look at the composition of the fiscal of the public finances on both sides, on the expenditure and on the revenue side. So as I said, we had these orientations explained in the communication in March. In the last phase of the recovery, well, I think that we will have to more focus on addressing the legacies of the crisis and on all the policies that are going to be supportive for productivity, as Maria mentioned, which will be a key factor here. And in that context, we think that, I mean, we see this recovery and resilience facility with the recovery plans, a combination of those things, both investment and reforms in that direction. So that's combined with the fiscal policy stance should be the kind of the more medium-term supportive phase of the policies. Now, just one last comment on the fiscal rules. Indeed, we launched this debate before the crisis. We stopped it because obviously for obvious reasons. It will have to be relaunched later this year, probably, not yet decided. For sure, we are not going to come back to the previous rules. We are going to think about what are the rules that are relevant, necessary, helpful, whatever you want to call it, in order to get the fiscal policy to do the job that the economy needs. And there, I think that there are two elements that I would like to mention. One, we need to reflect on how the fiscal rules can support sustainable growth. And two, we need to reflect the role that some sort of debt rule should play in the fiscal framework, because no matter what, debt will become will remain an issue. But so we will come back to that debate probably in the later part of the year. And the last point on international coordination, I think because I'm sitting myself in the G20 Deputies Finance Group, and it has been really important that it was a full agreement on the need not to repeat the mistakes of the previous crisis in terms of not withdrawing policy support too early. And that has been clearly, maybe not at the consensual at the first minute, but it became consensual very quickly, I should say. And I think this is very important, and that remains the key message in that context. The second thing that I think it's important to be addressed by international coordination is that the recovery efforts have to be more inclusive and address inequalities. And here I think that the whole debate on the taxation, on the minimum tax and the digital tax, as they are known, that it is being conducted in the context of the OECD, G20, and the aim is to reach a consensus by the mid-21. That's a very important part of it, and well, I hope that we will deliver on that. The other block is the support to the low-income countries. I will not go into detail, but this has been a very important area for international coordination, and it's continuing, including with the discussion and most likely agreement to increase the SDR, a new SDR allocation at the IMF level, and how to reallocate these resources in order to make sure that they reach the countries they need the most. And finally, what I would say is that it is, from the EU perspective, very important that there is consistency between domestic and international policy developments, because as we have seen, spillovers are very big. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, and good to know that we will not go back to the previous rules. You know, I take that as the big headline from your talk. Andre, you've been looking as well at the issue of international coordination over the past months. What is your take on that front?
Yes, hello everybody. Very interesting discussion, and very much share the view that yes, there is a need for greater international coordination. I think the big question is, you know, in which areas. I think we need to prioritize the possibility really to make progress. You know, one can never list a wish list, and by the way, the wish list that we have now is the wish list that we had already before the crisis, and that, you know, always comes back. So I think we really need to focus on what we can hope to deliver, and hope to deliver at a time which I think is not a very easy time. So in a sense, there is a discrepancy, it seems to me, between the increasing need for coordination and the decreasing possibility of coordination because of geopolitical tensions. I think geopolitics is not just you know, the buzzword here in Brussels. Geopolitics is very much dominating many of those issues. I think no doubt there is more and more a you know, call it systemic rivalry, systemic competition between the more liberal-minded countries and the more authoritarian ones, maybe exemplified by the increasing tensions between China and the United States. So yes, need for coordination, and as I said, I think difficulty because of this geopolitical tensions to actually supply the needed coordination. So where can we make progress, or where is the need the biggest, and where is the possibility to provide such coordination feasible? So from the discussion we are having, it seems to me that and I take very much Paul's initial point, that the recovery, at least in the advanced economies, where the savings rate, the household savings rate has increased substantially during 2020, that the recovery should be, at least initially, mainly driven by private consumption. Now, that clearly does not need any coordination. There's no need for coordination within countries. There's no need for coordination within Europe. There's no need for global coordination to have consumers if indeed they regain sufficient optimism to spend some of their accumulated savings. So, I think macroeconomic coordination is really not a priority. And in any event, yes, I think in Europe or in some of the emerging countries, as was mentioned, I think we all have to take into account what is the policy of the Fed. But this is not coordination. This is simply taking into account the policy, whether the policy is excessive and the policy will lead to an inflation bout in the US, yes or no. This is something that is not going to be a matter for policy coordination at the international level. So coordination, I think, is not about the macro. The one element, I think, which Elena has mentioned that is linked to the macro and linked not so much to the consumer driven recovery, but then to the investment driven recovery, where public investment is an important element, is the financing, the issue of taxation. And coordination of taxation, I think, is indeed a major issue, if only for political reasons. Whether it's coordination at the G20 level or more at the OECD, it seems to me that it's much more at the OECD level, in fact, than at the G20 level. So where is the G20? Where can the G20 play a role, and a very useful role? I think what Franco discussed, the issue of the debt overhang, especially for the low and medium income developing countries, is indeed a major issue. We know that their progress has been very difficult. And progress has been difficult because on the one hand, we have essentially, let's say, the advanced economies, the OECD countries, or the G7 countries, and on the other, China. So I think it's not really a G20 coordination. One needs to come to some kind of coordination between China and the, let's say, the members of the Paris Club. That's essentially what it boils down to, or one has to revise the Paris Club to have a role for China. So I think the issue of China and, let's say, the West is really the major elephant in the room when it comes to coordination, international coordination, at least at the G20 level. So the question that I've been asking myself is really what space there is for the G20, even for some of the global institutions in general, what space there is for them to provide the needed, and I repeat, very much needed coordination, first and foremost on health. I mean, nobody's talking about health, but health is really the #1 issue on which we need global coordination. Yes, the debt is a problem for tomorrow or the day after, but the problem of today and the problem of the recovery, this is not going to happen in a smooth manner if we do not manage to make real progress at the global level in the area of health. No, there are many components to that. Trade and what is happening at the moment in Geneva at the WTO, the EU participating, the United States also participating with different plans, but at least both agree that we need to have some kind of coordination at the global level through trade measures in health, very much so. So if I were to pick one issue, forget about everything else, I would say health. Health is really the major point. Paul, you gave us a very nice graph, and prolonging the line from before the crisis, and saying 2024 is the date when inside the EU we will be back on track for growth. But what about at the global level? What is going on there if we are not making serious progress? And I'm talking serious progress about delivering vaccines to the global population, not just in the advanced economies, but in the rest of the world. That is the largest part of the world. So I would say, stop discussing any of those other issues. Debt problem, macro issues, focus on one issue. Hard enough. This is health and vaccination. This is really for me, the only priority for international coordination at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andre, and thanks as well for raising the issue of health. I think it is key, and one of the biggest, risks is indeed that we get a new strand that is much more aggressive. That the vaccines we have, we cannot really, that they are not efficient against that particular potential more aggressive strand. Christian, over to you on kind of the other big questions, I guess. The macro, but as well, I mean, I have little time, so I'm going to ask you as well, maybe to tackle one of the most popular questions in Slido, which is how worried we are about possible inflation in the United States, in Europe, etc. With this massive stimulus packages that we are seeing, especially in the United States. Over to you, Christian.
Yeah, sure. I will address that. And I agree with Paul that the recovery will in part happen by itself, endogenously as the pandemic ends. But the problems will start when the post-COVID boom fades out, because then we are roughly where we were at the start of 2020, with the added problem of higher private debt and potentially some bankruptcies from businesses that haven't survived this pandemic. Some may call that creative destruction, but the term creative destruction really is a misnomer. It should be destructive creation, because that's how structural change happens. It doesn't happen in downturns or crises. It usually happens during boom times. But that, just as an aside, I thought I'd take another step back and sort of look back at what are the lessons from the past 15 years of failed economic or slow economic recoveries in Europe that we should better heed this time. And I was glad to hear from Elena that some of them are being taken on board. So some of this may feel repetitive, but I will go through it quickly. So the first one, and this is a G20 and geopolitical one, is that relying on the rest of the world to bail out Europe is politically costly. And in any case won't work now, because the rest of the world cannot create the demand that Europe needs to grow stronger after the post-COVID boom fades out. So post the great financial crisis, we had China and emerging markets playing a strong role, later the US and the UK during the Euro crisis. But it's a mistake. It makes us politically vulnerable. It breeds instability elsewhere down the road. And so the first lesson is Europe this time around needs to recover by itself and also be able to maintain that recovery by itself. The second has mentioned plenty of times now, so I'll make this short. Withdrawing fiscal support early is economically unwarranted and politically harmful. And I think that is the lesson that is widely agreed now. Austerity in the past was badly timed. We needed our economies to recover and recover fully before we think about consolidation. And the recovery in the Eurozone largely coincided with when austerity was put on the back burner. The third is monetary policy. I think this has not been mentioned yet, but is one important lesson that I think the ECB has learned. So I'm much more optimistic on this. Monetary policy needs to stimulate preemptively and aggressively and avoid a premature exit. And I think over the last decade or so, the ECB was often slow to react and only started to act when the data showed that it was inevitable, but that's too late for a central bank to react. And then the ECB tightened actively or passively when the recovery started, instead of reporting the recovery to the end. In part, that was because the ECB almost comically misjudged inflation. And that means that the ECB later had to loosen again. The fourth lesson is that public debt and inflation are less of a concern than we thought. I think one of the drivers of our fiscal and monetary tightening or tight policies over the last 15 years was the fear of debt and inflation. But by early 2020, I think many realized that neither inflation nor public debt should be our main concern at first. In fact, the structural factors, and that brings me to the question, Miguel, that you put, the structural factors in Europe and around the world that are pushing down demand and interest rates and inflation are still very strong and are still intact. Now, the post-pandemic recovery may lead to some temporarily higher inflation. In fact, I would be disappointed if it didn't, right? I would expect prices for, say, restaurants or holidays to increase quite strongly, actually, considering that there will be a demand boom for some types of products. And there will be supply constraints and so on. So there will be some high inflation, visibly high inflation, but a broad-based and sustained surge in inflation, I think, is highly unlikely in Europe. And if you ask about the US, well, in the US, there's also the same issues apply. Of course, you have a much bigger fiscal stimulus in the US than in Europe. And that fiscal stimulus alone will push the economy further in this post-pandemic boom. And of course, that will sort of exacerbate some of those supply shortages or labor shortages locally and so forth. But again, creating a sustained inflation would require that we have a constant overheating of the economy. It would require fiscal policymakers to continue with that kind of stimulus. It would require monetary policymakers to not only let this see through sort of the immediate post-COVID boom, which may lead to inflation, but also further to let this run out of control. I think that that combination is highly unlikely, and we over here in Europe, we don't even have that amount of stimulus. And on public debt, I think the issue is similar. We thought that public debt was a major issue, and it was, and it still is in some parts of Europe, but I think our emphasis should be on restoring growth, because if you do want to reduce the debt to GDP ratio, that is one point that Paul made before, the best way to do that is growth and not austerity. And that also means that the quality of spending matters and not just the headline figures of debt to GDP. And the fifth point is on potential output. The simple truth is we don't know the potential output of our economies. That was true before this pandemic started, and it's definitely true after this pandemic. So relying on our potential output measures should not be what we should be doing at this point. If higher demand, for example, drives investments, and this means potential is also endogenous, right? That means the hotter the economy runs, the more potential there will be created. And extrapolating trends from the past show you, depending on which start date you take, that the gaps in output can range from, I don't know, 0, as Paul said, in 2022 to probably something around 10%. So let's not rely on output gap estimations when conducting fiscal and monetary policy. Instead, make both fiscal and monetary policy clearly state contingent. And that means maintaining monetary support until inflation really comfortably has reached the 2% level, and that sustainably. And if that requires overshooting inflation, that is fine. And also fiscal policy should be made state contingent, ideally on some form of employment measure, so that we finally get to full employment before we reduce support. But you know, I'm glad to hear Elena say that the pre-pandemic GDP levels will be taken into the calculation. I would prefer to go further back in time, but let's start with that. But definitely not count on the output gap measure to give you a precise picture of where the economy is. Thank you.
Wonderful. And we just hit 5:30 and the 60 minutes we had, but I was told by the organizers we can go 10 minutes beyond the given time, and so as well kind of taking some more questions that we have on Slido. And Christian, you were just talking about as well about growth, and here, you know, there are a few questions on what kind of growth we generate in the future. And so I have 3 questions that I'm going to put to you guys, and you can just pick whatever question you want to answer in the couple of minutes that I will give you. We unfortunately, I think, lost Franco Bruni, but hopefully he comes back. If not, we do it without him. The first is, precisely on climate change. I think no one really mentioned climate change or addressed the issue and how, the green element that is so important as well for the recovery in Europe. So what are your thoughts on the greening of the economy and perhaps even the political economy of all of it? Because I think that's sometimes the elephant in the room, right? The Gilets jaunes, they were there, they might be still with us and they might come back, right? And so that is question number one. Question number two is more on the element of inclusiveness. So, that topic, I think, didn't really appear sufficiently. Inclusiveness in all areas, of course, gender, but as well the young people and migrants perhaps as well. Just all weaker kind of layers of society that might need to be brought into this growth and recovery. And the final one, which might be perhaps the more interesting one, is the question was really what happens if one country does not ratify the own resources directive for the next generation EU, but I would broaden it even further, not only whether someone or a country does not ratify, but even what do we do if a country says that the performance of another country in the recovery is not good enough, and we have the big tension that, let's say, the Dutch parliament says, look, what Italy or Spain are doing, it's not good enough. And do we have really, some sort of framework with dealing with a situation like this? Who wants to go first? Shall we go in the order of the people we had? Paul, do you want to start? You can take, any of these three questions, and you have a couple of minutes to tackle.
Okay, thank you. On the last one, I have not much to say, so I will avoid and the last one. On the first question, yes, of course, this is probably the most important question, existential question we face today, right? We have been talking about issues that are also important, no doubt, but the green economy and sustainability of growth. I think we need growth, but we have to make it sustainable so as to avoid disasters in the environment and climate. And that is the big problem, the big challenge that we face. I'm not myself an expert on these matters, but one thing that I would like to stress is that we surely have to push much more than we have done up to now, the need for public investment. Of course, the Next Generation EU is an attempt and a great attempt to go in that direction at the European level, but we also should make it possible for national governments to do it, because most of the action will have to come from there. Right? Let's face it, the European Commission has only a limited capacity to issue bonds because its capacity to tax is also limited, while national governments are the institutions that have the capacity to tax and therefore are capable of issuing debt aimed at financing public investment geared towards a more green economy. And we should really free national government from the shackles that we have imposed on them, like the fiscal compact and all that makes it very difficult for them to finance public investment by issuing bonds, right? So we have to, in the new fiscal rules, the priority should go to eliminating that element, right? All the rest we can live with it, but this we should not accept, and was discussed earlier. There have been many proposals to go in that direction. So that's, I think, a priority we should have on inclusiveness. Yeah, we will. That's also quite important, because we have seen now how during the pandemic many people got short-shifted and others gained, right? And if you want to avoid that, we develop a system for which the social consensus becomes weaker and weaker because it's considered to be unfair, right? Then we have to do something. And that also means, among other things, taxation, right? Taxation of wealth. We really have to be serious about these things. We cannot afford that so many super rich get even richer and influence the political agenda and undermine democracy. So these are key issues that we have to confront. But I think I want to stop here. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks, Paul. Maria.
Perhaps can I second this issue that I do think that climate is the number one question, is the most important question actually. But I think it's so important that it merits kind of a conversation of its own. And the fact that we didn't mention it here is not because we don't believe it's important. I think it's actually crucially important. The European Union has a leadership role to play there, globally speaking, and there is so much going on in terms of the next steps into greening the economy, from the economy all the way to finance. So I think there is a lot there. So I just want to just say that this is not that we don't believe it's important; it's crucially important. I wanted to add perhaps on the third question also, because Paul didn't mention there that Miguel, you're pointing to the imperfect architecture of the EU, and that remains a fact. And until we have a political union, we will never be able to square that circle, and perhaps we never will. But I think if we don't, then we have to deal with an imperfect architecture, which has problems of the sort that you've just raised. And with that, I just wanted to make one additional point on inflation, because I think it relates to that. I don't believe that we have risks of inflation, and even if we did, as Christian said, it would be really welcome, because it will tell us that the economy is picking up, which is a good thing. The US has got good tools to deal with it. It's moved into a regime of average inflation targeting, which means it will tolerate the inflation for much longer. I think the European Union is also going in this direction, but we need to wait and see how this will play out. But I would like to point out an important difference between the EU, the Eurozone rather, and the US when it comes to that issue. And that is that if we were to see sustained inflation, and again, I repeat, I don't believe we will, but if this is a tail risk, this will put the ECB in an awkward position, because it is still very much in the level of wanting to prevent financial fragmentation. But if deflation were to pick up, it will feel compelled to increase interest rates. And that, of course, would mean that there would be two alternative objectives that are pushing against each other. That's the only risk that I see as a result of witnessing more inflation. And not to mention that there is this issue of the German Constitutional Court, which I think that if inflation picks up, there will be another challenge. And that, of course, comes back to the architecture issue. And how do we deal with that if that were to not be resolved in the way that it has in the previous occasion? I'll stop here. Thanks.
Wonderful. Wonderful. We have Franco back talking about green, and I was just the other day thinking that with all the gadgets and digitization that we have, etc., if you lose electricity, then you are cut off, and that I think was the case. But as well, I mean, the amount of electricity that we are using, right? I mean, digitalization and green, as you all know, there might be some incompatibilities or contradictions there. But I asked Franco to go last in this round. I just typed him the three questions we have. So we proceed with Elena, Andre, Christian, and then Franco, and not make it too long. Just be as concise as possible, and you don't have to tackle all the questions. Okay. Elena.
Thank you. I will be brief. I fully agree that the climate would require a full conversation, so it's difficult to say it in a minute. But I think it is fully shared, this concern, and it is a kind of collective endeavor to find out the tools, etc., in many areas. So from the finance, the developing models to integrate climate risks. Central banks are working on that. IMF is working on that. Many others are working on that. So that's on the risk side. The EU is going to present this Fit at 55 package in June, which will include many elements from ETS to taxation to other stuff. So there is a lot of developments here, but I think we should probably tackle that alone. But for sure, everybody sees that as the major element, maybe together with health, as Andre said, to really two issues that are not going to go away with this pandemic. And I come back to that. There is a strong concern and strong commitment in the international fora, including G20 and others, to look at, at the current challenges in terms of vaccination, etc., to reach all the countries, but also in more pandemic preparedness, more in the medium term. So I cannot go into the initiative, but there are a number of initiatives on the table on that matter. And just a last comment on the third question, which indeed, as Maria said, the architecture is not what it should be in a way, and we have to deal with what we have. But I think one element that I see is an improvement is that in the current definition of the recovery plans and the way that this financial support is being organized is not just left to the member states to decide whether they think that the country is doing the right thing or not. There is the plans and the way at how to look at what progress is being made is quite well defined in the plans themselves and in the way to assess the progress made and therefore to continue providing the financial support. So at least there is an element of more, I would say, objectivity on how to look what is going on in a country and more of ex-ante commitment from the countries as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Elena. Andre.
I'm on board with basically everything that has been said. I think climate change, absolutely. So again, if I go back to my plea for singling out the health situation, the COVID situation, as the #1 issue for global international coordination, the next one is climate change. There's no doubt, right? Neither the health nor the climate issues, not issues, problems, can be even remotely tackled without international cooperation, right? We can do all of the nice plans we want in Europe about both the health and the climate, but we are just a small part of the ocean of the world. So unless we make really progress at the global level, we are not simply doing the job that is needed. So completely agree. And if we can really be successful on those issues, and we try to maintain some degree, let's not be naive, some degree of distance with geopolitics, right? I know that you can't do that even with health or with climate change, right? You can't. One should, but the reality is that humanity is not wise enough to be able to separate those emergency in health and climate from geopolitics and systems rivalry. But assuming that one could do enough progress on health and climate change through global coordination, then indeed the other issues that are not going to go away, where the rivalry is present, and where I think the real risk are there of a Cold War or something even worse, at least we would have a framework to be able to deal with this. My worry, to be very, very frank, is that, and again, I'm taking this discussion to be about G20, not about our internal EU discussion about our recovery plan. I'm taking this discussion about what are we trying to do at the global level, and what role can the G20 play into this. My worry is that unless the G20 as a forum delivers #1 on health and then on green, then we are in real trouble. Then the window, where we had this discussion about the G20 being an important platform for dealing with global issues and for international coordination, that hope that we all had will simply go away. And that's why my plea is focus on what are the most important issues of the day. #1, health. #2 is climate. And then use that ability, if that ability is there, that ability at the global level to be able to sort of forego other considerations to deal with those global issues, then use that that capital to enlarge the discussion to other matters. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andre. Christian, maybe you can tackle the inclusiveness aspect. I know that you have reflected on these points, and recently we had as well the Porto Declaration this month, where leaders met, again pleading for the social elements and that this recovery would be inclusive. Just talk, or are we going from talking to walking?
That's a tough question, because the question to my mind is, we have seen how lower incomes in particular have been hit in most countries during this pandemic. And I'm not sure whether compensation is the right term, or whether we should sort of say, okay, we need to focus on making this inclusive, but we do need to make sure that those segments of the population that have been hit not just by this pandemic but also over the last decade, that they are considered first and foremost. And I think that was one of the mistakes, maybe the sixth lesson that I should have added before, sort of the mistakes from the previous recoveries. In part, my hope is that what Paul described in terms of the recovery being endogenously driven by a surge in consumption, that one of the effects we will see is decent wage growth at the bottom end of the distribution. And I think this is one of the first this inflation debate we are seeing when Larry Summers points to McDonald's workers getting $15 an hour now as a bad sign for the upcoming inflation. I personally think it's a good sign that we are using the labor shortages that we have to push up wages in these sections. And the other thing we haven't touched upon as much, because climate change and the health aspect at the moment take precedence, is demographic change, and to what extent sort of I think long expected shift in the balancing of power between the capital and the labor side on labor markets will actually play out, right? So the young people, particularly in this pandemic, have been hit particularly badly. But the demographic change coming now may shift some of that bargaining power back to them. So I'm fairly optimistic that almost endogenously this recovery will be more inclusive than the previous ones.
Okay, that's a good way to end. But we will end with Franco, as well as kind of the co-leader of the task force of the T20 on international finance and ISPI member. You might have the last word of this panel before I conclude.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm sorry I lost part of the discussion. I sort of lost the line, but let me thank, first of all, on behalf of ISPI, all the participants to this interesting, and the organizers, in particularly Bruegel. On the issue that I've seen been raised in some questions, well, the task force number 9 on international finance that I co-lead, well, we have several contributions still to be worked out completely. And I invite everybody to give a look to the final briefs that we will produce. They deal with climate, they deal with inclusive growth, with health, with digital, and how the financial system could help to go in these directions. There is also a paper on standardization of ESG measures that should also guide in part monetary policy and banks policies. Just one note on the one question I've seen is about next generation EU and what happens if it fails. Well, I'm a fanatic, obviously, of next generation EU, and I hope it doesn't fail. But there are political issues. But there's also one problem that that I'm worried about, and this is the impact of the very low interest rates and very expansionary monetary policy on the success of next generation. I mean, what I see is that the interest to get debt on that facility is decreasing. I mean, some countries do not want to go into the debt part of next generation because they can borrow easily on the markets at very low interest rates. If this goes on, this is another type of failure of next generation. Already the ESM has failed. I mean, the ESM facility on health is not used because countries can get the money anyway on the markets at very low interest rates. The central bank buys everything, and so why should you sort of get precise on the quality of your expenditures? And this, I think, is very bad, because what the Commission has done in proposing this, what the European Union has done in proposing this, all the stuff, I mean, from SURE to next generation, is to be careful, provide a lot of credit, but in exchange of a quality of a good quality of the expenditures. And with very low interest rates and the possibility of selling all sorts of bonds to the central bank, basically this incentive to go to and accept the challenge of the Commission is decreasing. And this, I mean, in my country where we have a lot of these problems, fortunately we are not discussing this, and we will go, but this is not the same in other countries, and I hope that this is not going to be a sort of a perverse effect of monetary expansion on the new type of fiscal expansion that Europe has invented, and that I think it's very, very good. Thank
very
you.
Good point.
Bye,
Franco. And I think it relates as well to creating actually a pool of sovereign debt, of European sovereign debt, of risk-free asset that can compete as well with the US bond, right? I mean, I think that is as well the opportunity there. Okay, so in perhaps a Spanish manner, we went a bit over time, but I think the conversation deserved it. And I thank Andre, Maria, Elena, Christian, and Paul, and Franco for this very interesting panel. For our institutions, the four institutions, this was a very pan-European exercise here. I don't know, Maria, if you want to say as well a few words, but it was a pleasure to be chairing this and to discuss this with our partners. And I'm sure that within even this Italian presidency of the G20, which the summit is in October, if I remember correctly, we'll have more times to discuss all these issues and make it as successful as Andre wants it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you all for participating.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.